So it actually, though, is a topic that I've been thinking quite a bit about. And when you think about cyber conflict, you hear over and over again how the offense has the advantage. And the offense only has to be successful once. The offense has the first mover advantage. The offense is going to win. And if you're in the security business, that's pretty depressing. So I've been thinking about that. And as I thought more about it and studied about conflict, really, that's an aberration. And what I'd like to talk to you about for the last talk here at S4 Europe is why I believe in cyber conflict, specifically in the ICS arena, that defense will win. Now, probably the place to start is history. Conflict has been studied for centuries. We have a lot of data on this. And over the centuries, there have been times when the offense has been predominant, and then there have been times when the defense has been predominant. But it has never been the case where one side has been predominant for century after century after century. So the idea that in any arena of conflict that one side would have the advantage over the other for a long period of time would go against history. We also have examples where people think this is going to change. And since we're right here in Austria, we can use World War I as a great example. Bismarck's wars at the end of the century, right before World War I, he was so dominant offensively in the techniques and the speed and the maneuvers that the smartest people, the scholars at that time prior to World War I, had this thing they called the cult of the offensive. And it was believed that offense had such an advantage that whoever attacked first was likely to win, because you were not going to be able to stop the other person from successfully attacking you, so you needed to attack them first to win. Obviously, that proved not to be true, with World War I on the European theater being one of the great defensive battles with tragic loss of life. We can look at a variety of other weapons. You see a list up there. When you look at air power was an entirely new, let's say, campaign or theater, just like cyber is an entirely new campaign or theater. And for a while, offense did rule the day there. You know, how are you going to stop these planes? Well, we came up with ways to do that. And in all these cases, there have been defensive measures that have taken over. And in fact, as a rule, if you look over the centuries, and Clausewitz talks about this, as do many other scholars, in general, it is easier to defend than to attack. Now, he talks about, in that quote that you see up there, he talks about it's because you have knowledge and control of the terrain. And you might think, well, how does that really apply to the ICS world? Well, we as defenders, we know our control system better than the attackers. We should know our process better than the attackers. We can make changes without having to break into it. We don't need to develop a simulator to test an attack. So we have, if we choose to take advantage of it, some substantial advantages over the defender. We're in a very dangerous point in time right now, because I think it is fair to say that in the cyber realm, including in the ICS cyber realm, today the offense does have the advantage. And historically, in times when offense had an advantage, there was much more conflict. This goes back to that cult of the offensive argument, but also it also led to an arms race. Because if you knew the only way you were going to be effective in conflict was to have weapons to attack your adversary, you spent a lot of time building up those weapons. And I would argue that we're seeing that today. We're seeing evidence of that publicly, and I can't even imagine what's going on that we don't see, where governments and other organizations are developing offensive weapons to attack control systems. Because that's what works right now. That's what wins in conflict today, because we're so reliant on offense and we haven't figured out how to defend against these attacks yet. But there's some good news here, and it's a little counterintuitive, and if you want to read more about this, Robert Jervis has a great book. It's a little dated, but still good. It's from '78, and he goes through all sorts of game theory, and what he shows is that if you can improve the defense, you reduce conflict, because obviously someone is less likely to attack you if they don't think they will succeed. That makes sense, right? But what isn't so obvious is that actually improving your adversary's defense is likely to reduce conflict. Because if he feels like you are not going to be able to successfully attack him, he has less need to develop his own offensive capability, he's less worried about conflict or other type of attack. So as a community, we actually benefit if working together, we can find a way to improve defense. I mean, this is a great thing. The other part that was kind of interesting is if you think about the physical world, you could spend money on guns and tanks and missiles, and those could be used for offense or defense. So certain types of expenditures in conflict actually raise the tension, because if someone buys a bunch of guns or tanks or missiles, you don't know if he's going to use them to attack you or to defend against your attack. But if you have the case like fortifications, fortifications can't be used to attack someone. So if you spend a lot of money on defense that can't be used for attack, that again reduces the probability of conflict. And I believe in the ICS community, most of what we would spend on defense would not apply to offense. So we have some real benefits here, some bright spots for the future. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but we have to realize that defense is not just the direct method of stopping the attack. There are indirect defenses, because very rarely are two adversaries not sharing any link, where one gains completely and one suffers completely. You can think of economic ties are a good example of this. If the US and China were to have some hostilities, it would hurt both economies. The danger, though, and you can see that there, the danger is sometimes this intertwinement is overestimated. And there were actually, going back to World War I, there were actually a lot of very prominent scholars who said war in Europe was no longer possible because the economies were so intertwined, that it would be economic suicide for these countries to go to war, and it would never happen. So we can't overestimate these indirect factors. So now let's get back into the cyber world. I have a few quotes up here. In cyberspace, the offense has the upper hand. That's from the U.S. Undersecretary of Defense. And if you look at the last quote, I was shocked actually that this was said out loud in congressional testimony, but Admiral Rogers, who's director of NSA and head of U.S. Cyber Command, actually said out loud that we can't stop computer attacks, so we're going to develop a lot of offensive weapons. So this feeling that offense was the way to go is very prevalent. And then that middle quote, the attacker only needs to succeed once, while the defender must succeed every time. I couldn't ascribe that to anyone because I saw so many people saying it. It was one of the most common quotes when I was searching for quotes like this. I think the definition here of success is really skewing the way we think about this problem. So here's two books. I'm sure some of you have read them. On the left, it's Cyber War Will Not Take Place by Thomas Rid. And on the right, There Will Be Cyber War by Richard Steenan. So you would think these two gentlemen disagree greatly. But in fact, the books have very little disagreement in them. They both make their case very compelling, and I would say if you were to read each one of those books, you would agree with each one of the authors. There's one difference. They define cyber war differently. So if you were to use Thomas Rid's definition of cyber war, Richard Steenan would prove to you that it will take place, and vice versa. So in the same way, we need to think about this thing of what is success? If there's an offensive effort against our ICS, what are we calling success? Okay. I think today the way we're treating it is any impact on an ICS is considered an offensive success. So if an attacker can come in and read some data, he's hacked the system, he has succeeded. If he can cause one thing to crash, if he can cause a 1-minute outage on some non-critical process, or you'll see major stories, you probably saw this, where a small dam, you can hardly even call it a dam, a small water facility in the state of New York got, quote, hacked. Caused no impact at all, but was covered in almost all the major newspapers in the United States and all the news media. If we're going to say that offense wins anytime they do anything at all to our control systems, we are going to fail. We are going to, because we're defining it incorrectly. And I guess I would say this is not unique to the cyber world here that we're living in now. If you think of automobiles, there's accidents all the time. People, unfortunately, are dying and being injured in auto accidents, but we don't consider auto travel unsafe. We still get in our cars, we still do these things. But as soon as a plane goes down, a certain number of people think air travel is unsafe, even though statistically it's much safer. And I think you probably, since we're in this business, you've all thought about self-driving cars. Can you imagine the first time a self-driving car causes a fatality? It's going to be thought these things are terrible, we can never do them, even though their percentage of safety is going to far exceed human drivers. So just as human beings, we're not very good at processing this data, so I understand why we fell into this trap with cyber incidents in ICS. So we need to start thinking about what is offense winning in ICS cyber conflict. So I guess there's two ways I would look at this. One is, has the attacker achieved his goal? If he wanted to bring something down for a period of time, has he achieved his goal? But even this is not necessarily a good measure, because maybe the attacker's goal doesn't really affect the defender at all. I think the better measure of success is, has the attacker caused an unacceptable impact to the defender? So I think by that definition, we could certainly say that we maybe through dumb luck, but defense is winning today because this has rarely happened. We have some experience of this in the security community. In the 80s and 90s, I was active in the financial services security and attended some standards meetings with people who issue credit cards. And they'll never say this on the record, but when you would get in a room with them, they would say, oh yeah, we're not even trying to prevent fraud absolutely. They had a number, they had a percentage, and as long as fraudulent transactions were below this percentage, they were perfectly happy. They weren't going to spend another dime. They were going to declare victory. Okay. Same with data breach. This one's a little more interesting. I got this data from a paper from Weiss, the workshop on economics of information security. If you want, I can give you that later. But they said of the data breaches that resulted in personal data compromise, only 4% of them were prosecuted, half of those were thrown out, and the actual damages were minuscule. So from the companies that were compromised, this was not really a security failure. It was within the acceptable impact. And I think this ties into part of what Frank was talking about earlier when he was talking about the German law, that is the case where governments and regulation needs to step in when the business impact is perhaps acceptable, but the societal impact is not. Okay, so now let's look at two of the most famous ICS events. Last December, right before Christmas, the power went out in Ukraine. And the damages, 1 to 6 hours of power outage for 230,000 people. I've lived in Florida where there's hurricanes and you have no power for a week, much larger numbers. That, for an electric utility, that is not something you want, but that is not a catastrophe. The real cost to the electric utility was probably the cost to send the people out to the substations to run them manually, the cost to try to clean the substations out, probably some overtime and such. And some people would argue, well, the reputation to the utility took a hit, so the utility was no longer as valuable. But again, if we're being honest here, where else are you going to buy your power from? And it could, if this were the United States, that utility might go to the government who can approve the rate increase, and they might actually get a rate increase because of this incident. So it could be far from a negative thing from them. Now, Stuxnet is a little more interesting. So Stuxnet, depending on who you believe, damaged or ruined 1,000 to 2,000 centrifuges, and you can put a price tag to that. It cost the Iranian nuclear enrichment facility at Natanz 1 to 2 years, and that is believed to be about the equivalent as if it was bombed. So this isn't a case where maybe from the offensive perspective this was a win. From the defensive perspective, they had other sites enriching uranium. They started doing it again after they recovered. I'm sure they weren't happy with the situation, but I don't know if this impact was acceptable or unacceptable to them. So in general, defense, the way we should think about defense winning in the ICS world is preventing very bad and costly things from happening. We shouldn't think that defense loses any time anything ever happens by an attacker on our network. And again, this ties right into risk management, which we now need to start thinking about. So I'm going to just finish up with 3 slides on defense, and then close. This one is the obvious one. So this is what we've been talking about this week. We've been talking about we need to improve the security of our ICS. We need to deploy these new devices, these new protocols. We need to have change management and inventory. We need a lot of sorts of things. I like to call that second part cyber maintenance. I think we need to start focusing on cyber maintenance, because if you talk to people that are responsible for running the physical equipment that is monitored and controlled by ICS, all that equipment has a maintenance plan associated with it. Okay? The maintenance plan for most ICS is called run to fail. And that is actually a legitimate maintenance philosophy, but what it results in is unplanned and expensive outages. So we need cyber maintenance. We need to improve our security skill sets. We need to stop deploying brand new technologies without the ability to maintain them. We saw this early on with Active Directory. Now we're seeing it with virtualization. We really need to step up our game, and I think that's a lot of what we've talked about here. The 2 other areas are maybe a little less obvious. I think that there is a major opportunity to prevent offense from winning. So again, to prevent an unacceptable impact to your process or your control system by looking at what we're doing in protection and safety. Okay, if you think about it, protection is a very well understood discipline, well established, and it deals with probabilistic failure rates. But it really doesn't deal with the idea of an attacker specifically going after you. A directed attack by an intentional attacker. But we need to start thinking about that and tie that into our protection systems, because you can get dramatic risk reduction and dramatically prevent the offense from winning by low expenditures in the protection field. The trick to this is you have to make sure whatever you're doing in protection can't be hacked. Okay, so this trend to integrate safety systems and control systems is really dangerous in that perspective. Okay, so you need either a separate system or even a non-quote cyber system. So I mean, this could be something as simple as a pressure relief valve. That would prevent an attacker from raising pressure above a certain level in whatever it's monitoring. Or on the other side, you've got turbines are running, a big problem with turbines is vibration. If you have a vibration monitoring system that will trip the turbine if it starts shaking too much, you have just prevented the attacker from being able to cause your turbine to break because of vibration. There's one other example. Brian Singer at S4, I believe it was in 2015, he was talking about a process on the factory floor that was run occasionally that relied on a specific reading being accurate. And if that reading wasn't accurate and you ran that, you basically started that batch, really bad things happened. And that had happened once to them. So they put a process in place where before they ran that batch, they sent someone out on the floor to physically take that measurement and call back to the control room. That is an incredible protection feature that costs almost nothing. So there's huge opportunities to do better, to reduce the chance of an offensive win of causing this unacceptable impact by doing better with protection. And in fact, I think you will oftentimes get much better risk reduction in this area than by deploying more security. And the final area is recovery. You could tie this in with cybersecurity. It certainly is part of it, backup and recovery. But what we see in ICS today is people have relied on redundancy. If a component or if a server or a PLC or something is absolutely critical to operations, they'll put in another one, and if the primary fails, the backup will take over. That doesn't help you much in a cyber attack. And then when you ask them, well, how long, what does it take to recover? The answer is, well, as soon as possible, or we've never tried it, or something of that nature. So if you can actually set a recovery time objective that, again, makes a cyber incident, the impact of that acceptable to management, then it's really hard for the bad guys to win. If we look at Ukraine, I'm not sure they actually had this planned out, but in the end, their recovery plan was somewhere between 1 and 6 hours. They sent a bunch of people out to the substations and ran it manually. And that may be perfectly acceptable to you. But those three areas, I think, so I guess in closing, what I'd like to say is, we obviously need to do better in defense, right? We need to do a better job securing our systems. We need to look at the protection aspects to prevent these really bad things from happening. Again, because we've already done the work to know what these really bad things are. We just haven't thought about someone intentionally attacking them. And then we need to have a recovery time, so if we are successfully attacked, the impact will be acceptable. So we do all those three things, and we do improve our defense. But secondly, we need to relook and maybe recalibrate what we consider success from the offensive side. Because we're setting ourselves up for failure the way we're currently defining winning and losing in the cyber arena with industrial control systems. And I'm quite confident if we do both those things, it may not be this year or next year, but in the near future, in the ICS arena, defense will win. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any. End of day. I knew you liked that protection thing.
Yeah, I actually have solution which is based on the same, like on taking offline measurements. But back to defense, like I agree that we have to, like the defense should win. But I observed, so sometimes like the utility or owners have little chances. So I'll give the example. I was scoping a pen test project for like a monster solution for power distribution. So it was like one of the vendors, not Honeywell. And I told them, like, okay, guys, we need like the description of all of your servers and blah, 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 and we need a data flows diagram. And they say, we don't have it. I told them, like, well, then you have to call the vendor. And they say, like, yeah, we tried to reconstruct it without, like, ourselves, but for example, we know that something's happening here, but then it's black box, and then something here, so we don't know all of our flows, we don't understand. And the vendor refused to give them a data flow diagram. He said that it's just a proprietary knowledge. Then how on earth the owner of that solution can protect themselves even because they even have no chance to know which data flow is malicious and which not? This is a difficult question.
Well, so I think we have to, that's more of a tactical question. And there's no doubt that we have a lot of technical challenges as to how we're going to deal with these things. And so in that sort of thing, where what you'll see is a lot of the leaders in the asset owner community are putting more requirements on the vendors at the front end. Like if you want to sell us this is part of the factory acceptance test and that. So there's no doubt that we have to do a better job on the defensive side. But I think the main point I'm trying to make is that if we do this, we are not going to be in this situation for decades where the offense is always going to have the upper hand. But without a doubt, I mean, there are still many challenges that we've heard the last 2 days about this.
Please introduce yourself. This is Carl from Siemens. I really like your argument that for every new arena where the fight takes place, after some time the defense gets the better. And there's one small difference. I was wondering if you have an answer to it. For example, the airplanes that you said. At first we couldn't defend against them, but then we found ways. But the attacker has to throw in something that he might not want to lose, like his airplane. What is someone throwing in an ICS, cyber attack that is valuable to the attacker so that defense can actually have an impact on the attacker?
Yeah, there was I actually was going over this session with Ralph beforehand, and I had like 3 or 4 different areas, and it was way too much to cover in 30 minutes. That was one of the areas. I think this idea that we have today that the attacker can never be found out and won't have consequences is maybe a mindset that is too limiting. That may be the case today. I know it is difficult to do attribution today. But are we really saying that attribution is going to be impossible forever? And this whole idea that, let's say, the attacker only has to succeed once, well, the attacker, if they're caught once, if you think about it as a bank robber, a bank robber robs many banks, but he only gets caught once and then he suffers the ramifications. I think what we have to look at is that the person launching the attack, today it's viewed that that can be done anonymously with very little risk, with very little resources. I'm not sure that's going to be the case forever. I think it might be, it's certainly, people are very certain about that, and I don't know how we can have that kind of certainty.
Jeff Hahn with GE. Dale, it was refreshing to hear your presentation. It was great. I appreciate that. And if I may, I'd like to throw in a little anecdote with this. I used to lead the Idaho National Laboratory Red Team, Blue Team effort and bring teams in from all over the world doing Red Team, Blue Team exercises, right? We one time had a country come in, just one country, bring in their Red Team and members of industry. And I had an aha moment at the end of it, because they put the Red Team on the Red Team and the industry people in the Blue Team area to take care of the control system and the whole IT system and everything. And while the Red Team had some success of compromising a box here and there and things like that as they progressed their attack, at the end of the day, the industry had taken time to look at their firewall rules and close them up, to look at to patch what they could, to find other issues, and to map out their data flows and do everything that they needed to do with their intrusion detection systems, all the things that they knew to do. In the end, when the nation state was attacking, they couldn't do anything. They couldn't reach their objective. Let me say that. They couldn't reach their objective because of the defense that was there. So I full-heartedly agree with your theme.
But they probably did some damage, right?
They did a little bit, sure. You know, compromise a box here and compromise a box there.
But
Some
that's a really good example, I think.
collateral damage.
Yes, exactly.